No one in the A Song of Ice and Fire community agrees on anything. Secret identities, horse theories, time traveling fetuses, everyone has some issue or another with any theory or opinion advanced in the entirety of this community. That is, except for one. I think I found the one issue on which all A Song of Ice and Fire fans agree, that being that Theon Greyjoy's arc in A Dance with Dragons is virtually flawless. Pretty much everyone who's read the most recent book in the Song of Ice and Fire series agrees that Theon's part of it is just thoroughly fantastic. It's well written, and it's an incredibly tragic and beautiful arc for a character who many people weren't a huge fan of in A Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings. Today, I'm going to go over that arc and get into what I think is coming for Theon Greyjoy in the Winds of Winter, as I've had many thoughts on that over the years, and they're often changing, so I figured it'd be a fun character to examine and kind of recap as winter is coming. Theon Greyjoy is in an interesting and pretty unique spot as far as viewpoints go in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. Prior to the most recent book in the series, he'd only appeared in one book, that being not the most recent one, Feast for Crows, but rather A Clash of Kings, the second book in the series, where he makes no mistakes, no bad decisions, he does everything right, he does a great job just the entire time. At the end of A Clash of Kings, Theon is captured by Roose Bolton's bastard, and that's all we hear of him for the next three books. We get varying reports from around Westeros. Some people seem to think he's dead. We get a letter from Catelyn's perspective to her and Robb in the third book, where a piece of Theon's skin is attached. So it's unclear if he's being flayed to death or if he's being flayed alive. But overall, it's very different from the television show. In the television show, we are up close and personal with all of Theon's arc all the time. We are with him in the bowels of the Dreadfort being tortured. In the book, he's gone. Nobody knows where he is or what's going on. There's also a weird bit of a side note in terms of the history of A Dance with Dragons and Theon as a character, that being that George R.R. Martin himself spoiled Theon's return prior to the release of A Dance with Dragons. In his big Kong is Dead post that is going over many different details about this upcoming book, he notes two specific things. First off, that the character who is the individual who receives the second most chapters in the entire book, other than the main three characters, those being Tyrion, Jon, and Daenerys, is a character who was a viewpoint at one point in the past, but returns to us, quote, rather worse for wear. In my mind, that would signal one of two characters, that being either Theon himself or the resurrected Catelyn Stark. Additionally, he also states that there are three Greyjoy viewpoints in this book, and he also states that Aeron Greyjoy does not appear in A Dance with Dragons. He posted earlier saying he had kicked Aeron out of Dance and into Winds. By process of elimination, this tells us that yes, there are three Greyjoy viewpoints, and a viewpoint character is returning to us after an absence and after being worse for wear. So before Dance with Dragons even came out, we all knew Theon was coming back. Not that I knew, I was 11. I do also want to ask, who do you want me to cover next in this series? Let me know in the comments below. While you're down there, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and check out, I'm sure I have a playlist somewhere linked where I have more videos in the series. I think this might be the 10th. I could be wrong on the count there, but overall, yeah, thank you again for any support. I really wish I could have read A Dance with Dragons without knowing that Theon survived, because his first chapter, entitled Reek, as his first three are, is a just fantastic twist if you're coming into it with that mindset, as it's unclear who this twisted and tortured individual is until near the end of the chapter, though these clues are kind of subtly woven throughout. It's fantastic writing, and I really enjoy it, and it is sort of the darkest Martin gets in the series, I would argue. It's pretty much all on display in Theon's chapters. His first is fairly uneventful, other than just reintroducing Theon as a character, what has happened to him, who Ramsay is, because we really haven't seen him on screen as Ramsay, as he'd been disguising himself as Reek. His second chapter, as Reek 2, is kind of the capture of this Moat Cailin, this fort that had been encamped by the Ironborn throughout the War of the Five Kings. Theon goes undercover as Theon in order to claim it. This was shown in the HBO show, but overall, I think it's actually adapted pretty well there. It's one of the few scenes from A Dance with Dragons that is overall positive, I would say. And then Reek's third chapter mostly deals with Roose Bolton arriving back in the north and interacting with his son once again. And there are a lot of interesting back and forths there, and we get some more insight into Roose as a character and his opinion on both Ramsay and Theon in his current state. And honestly, I love all three of these chapters. I think out of those first three, Theon 2 was the highlight for me. I love all of Theon's chapters in this book, but one detail I really enjoy is that all of his four remaining chapters are different names. They're not all Reek, and each of those names pertain to the kind of exact theme of each of these chapters. Each of them is very kind of tightly constructed around a single kind of thematic idea there. The first, the Prince of Winterfell, is the return to this castle from which we've been absent for two books now. It is a very central place in the narrative, and it is a very important symbolic location for those lords of the North. It makes sense that the Boltons, being the newly appointed wardens of the North by Tom and Baratheon, would seek out this castle and wish to claim it as their own as a symbol of their legitimacy and true status and rulership of the North. This also signals Theon's role in this chapter. It's Ramsay's wedding, not to Sansa, as was the case in the show, but to supposedly Arya Stark, who is really Jane Poole, the daughter of Ned Stark's steward. This chapter is overall just tragic. There's a very cool moment where Theon hears a whisper from the Weirwood, which is likely Bran communicating with him, and it snaps him back internally to being Theon Greyjoy again. But that finally breaks at the end of Ramsay's wedding, where we see him revert back to Reek in a moment of fear and desperation. It's one of the most well written and horrifying chapters in the book, for my money. The subsequent chapter has a new name and a new focus. The Turncloak is very concerned with northern politics and conspiracies. If you heard about the Grand Northern Conspiracy, a lot of the evidence for that idea comes from this chapter. And the main action here is Theon having a conversation in the crypts with Barbary Dustin, who's a character who doesn't appear in the show and is great. She's a long history with the Starks, specifically Ned's older brother Brandon, who died before Robert's Rebellion, and she's a very fascinating character. This is followed by a ghost in Winterfell. There are no ghosts necessarily, unless you count Theon himself and perhaps the Hooded Man, if that is an alter ego of Theon's, as this individual doing murders throughout Winterfell. But that murder mystery is the backdrop of this chapter, as there is this degree of mounting tension as Stannis has begun to beat drums and blow a horn outside, and you feel just this era of fear emerge in Winterfell, and it's just fascinating to read throughout. Additionally, this is where Abel and his washerwomen begin to get up to some hijinks and mount tension on their own, as we know that they're responsible for at least one or two of the murders themselves. I've often heard Theon's final chapter, entitled Theon, cited as the best in A Dance with Dragons, and while it's no The Griffin Reborn, it's fantastic. It almost reads like a heist movie, as Theon is finally and truly himself again. He is taking action, working with Mance Rayder and the Spearwives to save Jane Poole from Ramsay and escape from Winterfell. He's able to do so successfully, though it's unclear in that moment as to whether or not he was successful, as it ends with him and Jane jumping off the ramparts of the castle, apparently into a snowdrift where they survive. It's kind of like the end of season 5 of Game of Thrones with him and Sansa jumping off the walls, as it could be reasonably construed as them not surviving it, but it ends up that they do. And at the end of A Dance with Dragons, in Asha, his sister's final chapter, we see that Theon arrives at the camp of the one true king, Stannis Baratheon, where we have one final chapter to discuss. We don't necessarily need to speculate on what's going to happen next for Theon in the Winds of Winter, at least at the start of the book, as he already has a sample chapter released. It's my second favorite chapter of the Winds of Winter we've already read, and Theon is isolated in Stannis' tower and mind here. He's the one true king's prisoner, and honestly, this chapter could be from Stannis' perspective. It's quite cool that way, but Theon does contribute via his insights on Winterfell, on Ramsay, and on the situation regarding northern politics on the whole. We see Stannis pen a bargain with Tycho Nestoris and send away Justin Massey to collect his coin. We see Stannis uncover the Karstark treachery, and we see Asha and Stannis make a deal. Specifically, Theon is intended to be executed by Stannis Baratheon for his treason against the Starks. He's trying to gain favor amongst his northern allies, as because Theon is very, very hated for killing supposedly Bran and Rickon, but actually the Miller's boys. Asha is kind of in the room and trying to convince Stannis of a different course of action. She's not trying to convince the king to spare her brother, rather she's trying to convince him to give him to the Weirwood tree rather than burn him alive, either of which would be a death for Theon. So it seems like he might not have much of a story in Winds, unless something different happens. I initially thought that Theon was a doomed man in the Winds of Winter. I thought he was very likely to die in or around the Battle of Ice and be sacrificed to the Weirwood. I actually talk about that a bit during my Night Lamp video, but I no longer think that is the case. Theon is such an important character in terms of the themes of Ice and Fire and having this amazing narrative that everyone loves. I don't think it is quite his time for one specific reason. I think that a core element of Theon's story is him coming to terms with and righting the wrongs he's done in the past. Specifically, I think that he cannot die until he comes to terms and is faced with one Stark at least. He's already kind of interacted with Bran through the Weirwoods, but it is very different than coming face to face with one of these individuals who he's so directly wronged. I think in terms of order of likelihood with that happening, I think Bran is pretty likely, as he is the one that Theon pretty much directly wronged the worst. Jon Snow, like happened in the show, could also be the case, as he thinks about Theon and his treachery a lot in relation to Robb. Sansa is also pretty nearby, and Rickon is probably on a crash course directly to Theon if he's survived. With that said, I think that Theon is quite likely to survive until he meets a Stark, at which point I'm not sure how much longer he'll last. So, what would this mean for Stannis in the Battle of Ice? It's likely that Stannis is going to need to sacrifice someone on this Weirwood Island in order to light up Lightbringer. We see when he executes the fake Mance Rayder, who's actually the Lord of Bones in A Dance with Dragons, Lightbringer glows super bright, and if he is trying to attract people to this island or otherwise disorient them, he would probably want that to happen. But it's worth thinking about the fact that Mance was a false execution. It wasn't Mance who was executed. Theon in the books looks awful. His hair is white, he's missing fingers, he's very haggard, he looks like an old man. Stannis just captured an old man, that being Karstark, Arnulf Karstark, who he could execute in Theon's place. He does deserve to die, and him meeting his end would mean a lot less to the story than Theon being snuffed out so early, as there is some more for Theon to do. What more does Theon have to do? Well, Asha hears a very relevant story, or she thinks back on it in A Dance with Dragons, that being the story of Torgon the Latecomer. This is an old Ironborn tale of an individual who should have been included in a Kingsmoot, as he was the previous king's only surviving son, but he was absent at the time. He was indisposed in warfare, and there was another individual raised up in his place who was very cruel and evil and a tyrant. He was cast down, and Torgon invalidated the Kingsmoot by way of his absence. The thought being that Asha could do the same by way of presenting Theon. Euron made this claim and won the Kingsmoot, despite the fact that Balon's apparent heir was absent, and Theon is the individual who could very much invalidate that. With that said, he's very far removed from the politics of the Iron Isles at this point. I've pitched in the past that Theon himself might not be the most likely character to carry this out. Specifically, in A Clash of Kings, Theon has a continued affair with the captain's daughter of a ship called the Miriam, which is based in Old Town, much nearer to the Iron Islands. He even specifically comments that she might be with child after how many times they've been together. My thought is that Asha will be informed of this by Theon, and she will use Theon's heir, which is better than Theon, as Theon at this point likely cannot produce an heir, to invalidate the Kingsmoot rather than Theon himself. Part of why I thought that Theon is likely to die in the Winds of Winter is that Martin has said this is going to be a very dark book, and it's going to be a book containing many viewpoint deaths. Because of this, I think that viewpoints that are in the same place and playing the same narrative role are pretty likely to die. I think that if someone is going to deal more with this Iron Islands politics, it is going to be Asha, and I think that Davos is probably going to arrive where Theon is soon to take up the torch as a new viewpoint in his stead. That is why I thought that Theon could have a decent chance of dying at that point, in addition to the fact that Asha could be pregnant at this point. She thinks that after being with Karl the Mage, she should to make moon tea, but she is immediately captured by Stannis and does not have a chance to do so, which also I think increases her chances of survival, as it is a Chekhov's gun waiting to go off, as many of Theon's Chekhov's guns, outside of meeting up with the Starks again, have already been shot and fired. There is one more key role I think that Theon could play in the Winds of Winter, that being his role in recapturing Winterfell. The castle in and of itself is more of a character than some characters in the series, and a lot of Theon's arc in A Dance with Dragons is dealing with the ways in which he's wronged this place by claiming it. But he is the individual in Stannis' camp with the best knowledge of this castle. If someone is going to allow Stannis a way in or know the ins and outs of the castle to claim it, it would be Theon. He's done it before. He has taken Winterfell before. Many people think about the Night Lamp as Stannis' crushing victory in the Winds of Winter, but it is only the first of what will need to be several victories. He will need to both defeat the Freys on the ice, he will need to claim Winterfell, and then he will need to defeat the Boltons. These are three separate objectives, and I think that Theon could be key to accomplishing those last two. Theon Greyjoy's arc is almost complete. Throughout A Dance with Dragons, he has reclaimed his name and truly become himself again. He has put to rest many of the demons in his past, and will likely continue to do so through helping Stannis early on in the Winds of Winter. I do not think he can truly rest until he has wrestled with the main sin that he has committed, that being his betrayal of his brother in arms, Robb Stark. This is a very close relationship throughout the early books, and it is one of the core sins that Theon committed. I don't think he'll be able to rest or die until that has been done. His death in Game of Thrones was one of the last decent moments of that show, despite being immediately undercut by Arya killing the Night King for seemingly zero effort. I think that if and when Theon Greyjoy dies, he is going to do so defending a Stark. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps grow the channel. It's free, and it's just a nice thing. I hope you all had a good holiday season and year. I think this should be out before the end of the year, which is better than I expected. I'm making good time on things. And I'll have many more A Song of Ice and Fire videos for you in the very near future, including in this series. We still have more Viewpoint characters to go, and once I'm done with Viewpoints, we'll go on to other characters. Thank you again. I'm sure we'll get to Winter is Coming for Areo Hotas sooner than later. Goodbye, everyone.